All right, we are recording. Welcome to the special All Community Vitality Commission's meeting. It is April 8th, 2025, and I will call roll. Trent Bush, I see you outside, Andy.
Present. Hello.
Hi, Trent. Tel Jones.
Here.
Danica Powell. Here. Ted Rockwell.
Here.
Andrew Shoemaker.
Here.
Erica Dahl is not here as far as I saw. Not on yet either. Okay. Stephanie Trees. Here. Ryan Cook.
Here.
Kevin Knapp is not here as far as I see. Robin Ronan.
Present.
Robin. Rebecca DiMichelle. Here. Stephanie Pike is not here. Sue Pram.
Here, sorry.
Thank you. Jennifer Streiber. See her here yet. Okay. I will turn the meeting over to the chairs for procedural order to.
So Ted has graciously offered to take on the chair role for this meeting since we've got such a large group and many chairs and vice chairs. So Ted, if you don't mind, so we do have some folks, it sounds like might be wanting to participate in public participation.
I just see a lot of people online. I don't know, we haven't offered to have them raise their hands yet. No one's signed up yet.
All right, so we are at the portion of the meeting where we will welcome any public participation in this special All Community Vitality Commission's meeting. Are there any members of the public who would like to speak now?
Any hands?
Any hands out?
I'm not seeing any hands.
All right, we'll let it run for 5, 4, 3, 2. Any hands, Ellie?
No hands.
Okay, so we will call public participation over, and I will turn it over to the finance department to go to item 3 on the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to take a moment real quick just to thank you all for coming together. This is our first joint commission meetings in probably 3 years. I think we had a summit. I think when you first got on
Virtual.
yeah, yes, way back when. So just want to thank you all for taking the time. We have a lot of conversations that we've been having, and the conversations we're going to have today are ones that we can either have done it over and over and over again with a lot of different smaller groups, or in preparation for our council meeting that we have coming up in a few weeks. This is a great opportunity to get everybody together, get your feedback on work that we're doing on not just the district analysis, but we also have Charlotte here who also needs to be meeting with boards and commissions on the city's long-term financial strategy. So she had approached me and said, hey, she wants to meet with commissions. And so this worked out really well. So she doesn't have to go to a bunch of meetings. We can get it all many birds in one swoop. So Charlotte is here to present some information to you all on the city's overall financial picture and some initiatives that are going on before we get into work related specifically to general improvement districts and commercial areas. So Charlotte, over to you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Charlotte Heskey. I'm the budget officer for the city. Good to be here with you this afternoon. I think I was just made a panelist, so I'll go ahead and share my screen. I'll be sharing out a very brief presentation, about 8 to 10 minutes, on the city's long-term financial strategy. And we're essentially looking at a comprehensive financial strategy for the city of Boulder and wanting to share that out. And we're doing somewhat of a preview presentation to all boards and commissions, or to invited boards and commissions, as we embark on this work, particularly in some of the community conversations to come around our long-term financial strategy. So our long-term financial strategy is a development of a comprehensive citywide strategy that has come really building upon prior policy recommendations that have come forward from the Blue Ribbon Commission reports of 2008 and 2010. This will serve as a comprehensive citywide strategy that we're focusing on to help guide fiscal decision-making and long-term financial health of the city. I mentioned this builds upon prior policy recommendations from two reports that were generated in 2008 and 2010, the Blue Ribbon Commission reports, as well as a 2019 report that was developed called the Budgeting for Community Resilience Report. And these reports really built upon and signaled on particular findings and recommendations for the city of Boulder. And so we're working on this as part of the long-term financial strategy. And those recommendations included calling for a comprehensive financial plan, cautioning the city's over-reliance on sales tax and dedication of funding sources, recommended the identification of core services and service level prioritization, and encouraged the development of an outcomes-based system of budgeting. Those familiar with our budgeting process over the past year may be familiar that we shifted recently over the past 3 years from an incremental-based budgeting approach to an outcome-based budgeting approach. And so we're on our way along this path of developing the recommendations and building upon the recommendations of the long-term financial strategy and working on developing the long-term financial strategy. Within the scope of this project and citywide financial initiative that we're working on, there are 4 primary work streams that we're focused on with 2 phases of work. And we received policy guidance both from a council committee called the Financial Strategy Committee that comprises 3 council members. As part of that, we meet monthly with them and receive policy guidance from them. We're also receiving policy guidance and input from several touch points that we're having throughout the spring and summer and fall from city council. And we also have an internal executive steering committee meeting. So just in terms of current and future state of what the long-term financial strategy is focused on, we know that we have a high amount of our organizations, our entire citywide revenues that are dedicated, reducing flexibilities to address community priorities and needs at the moment. And so as part of the work with the long-term financial strategy, we're working on increasing flexibility of funding to be able to meet emerging community needs. Our major revenue source, sales and use tax, has pointed to, particularly in thinking about our recent experience at the city with the pandemic period, reduces stability and predictability of our funding levels. And so we're focused within this effort and this initiative on increasing stability and diversity of revenues and reducing our over-reliance on sales and use tax. We also recognize that we have a significant unfunded and underfunded needs list of city services and expiring funding sources, proving it difficult to ensure reliability. Within our future state of the long-term financial strategy, we're focused on increasing reliability through establishing guiding principles, revenue identification, and community prioritization. And we'll talk more about this in a couple of slides and what those conversations are to come this summer and fall that you all are invited to participate in. And then finally, our recent practice is focused on short-term decisions, particularly in thinking about the growth out of the pandemic period and the rebuild out of the pandemic period. And so these recommendations and this initiative focuses on the development of a comprehensive long-term strategy for the city of Boulder that will help us to be able to comprehensively and holistically support core service levels and community needs. I mentioned we have 4 work streams that are associated with the long-term financial strategy. I'll just be brief with these, but that includes the long-term financial plan that's establishing guiding principles and developing a 5-year comprehensive plan for the city, looking at alternative funding mechanisms. What potential opportunities do we have for looking at our existing fees, potential new fees, and diversifying our revenue sources as a city, recognizing we have an over-reliance on sales and use tax. We're also looking at our core service levels and identifying our levels of service that the city should provide for programs and services through benchmarking analysis, as well as upcoming conversations to be had within Fund Our Future that are coming forward this summer and fall. And then finally, there's a multi-year ballot measure strategy effort that is part of this work. where we're looking at and have developed a framework for a strategy for 2025 potential tax ballot measures and looking into 2026. And again, much of this conversation and comprehensive community engagement is to come this summer and fall through an effort called Fund Our Future. We developed guiding principles as part of the long-term financial strategy that really align with and uplift the sustainability, equity, and resilience framework within the city. That includes fiscal sustainability and sufficiency, equity, and resiliency. When we look at the long-term financial strategy, we're really focused on under fiscal sustainability and sufficiency, ensuring that our core service levels are stable and predictable, that our revenue is diverse and flexible and sufficient enough to be able to meet core service needs as well as community priorities. Under equity, we're really focused here on looking at our revenue structures that we have across the organization, as well as our financial policies to aim to reduce tax burdens and fee burdens on historically disadvantaged groups. So that comes into play when we're looking at our citywide fee policy, what subsidies are we providing to particular populations across the city with the that we have. And then with resiliency, we're focused on the ability to adapt, anticipate, adapt, and recover quickly to adversity and change, supported by a diversification of revenues and sufficient reserve levels. These next few slides, I think I just have about 4 left, but these next few slides are really focused on the multi-year ballot measure framework and the community conversations to come around the long-term financial strategy. The multi-year ballot measure framework focuses on, again, a 2-year approach to potential tax changes that we're looking at within the organization. And so we've worked with city council, the council committee that we work with, the financial strategy committee, in building out this framework. Where in 2025, for potential tax ballot measures that we're exploring, we're focused on a more narrow incremental approach to potential tax changes with key focus areas and looking at unmet needs, taking care of what we have, and funding opportunities for core services. We shared with City Council last year during 2025 budget discussions that we have a significant unfunded and underfunded needs list that's currently around 380 million. We're going to be revising that list as part of the 2026 budget development process and requesting that from all departments and understanding what additional unfunded needs do we have across the organization. And so again, 2025 is really focused on these key focus areas for unmet needs and taking care of what we have. 2026 tax ballot measures for this second year of the multi-year ballot measure strategy is focused on a more comprehensive and creative approach to tax changes, focused both on our unmet needs and taking care of what we have, as well as additional investments in services and programs. So in thinking about the tax ballot measures for consideration within the long-term financial strategy, we worked with the Financial Strategy Committee in narrowing down. We performed staff analysis, looked at history of ballot measures, and worked with the Financial Strategy Committee over the past 6 months in particular on narrowing down potential tax ballot measure options for the full council consideration. And we're working with council and potentially bringing these forward as part of 2025 tax ballot measures. And that includes an extension of the existing 0.3% community culture, resilience, and safety sales and use tax from 2036 through 2050, or potentially extending that permanently to continue to support city infrastructure and maintenance projects, as well as nonprofit capacity building and capital investments. So this existing tax, 90% of this tax, about 15 million annually, currently supports city infrastructure. It is largely exhausted with the current term that we have that was approved from 2021 to 2036, and we're excited to advance over 20 key projects such as the East Boulder Community Center renovations, civic area, and investments in Pearl Street, for example, with this tax. And so 90% of that goes towards city projects, with 10% of it supporting capital infrastructure projects with nonprofits in Boulder. The second tax that we are exploring with City Council for 2025 is the creation of a public realm tax, which would increase the existing permanent parks property tax from 0.9 mils up to the max that we have allowed by city charter, so 2.252 mils. And expanding the use of this tax, again, really looking at flexibility of funding in alignment with those guiding principles of the long-term financial strategy. We're also looking at allowing debt issuance, and this would support infrastructure and capital maintenance projects that would more broadly fall within the public realm. This would include items such as parks, open space, civic buildings and areas, and the public right-of-way such as streets, sidewalks, bike lanes, and multi-use paths. Our approximate estimate for annual revenues with this tax would be about 7 million. And again, these two are really focused on that framework for 2025 and taking care of what we have at the city and our unmet needs. We have upcoming conversations as part of phase 2 of the long-term financial strategy and what we're calling Fund Our Future. And this will really be a holistic community conversation around potential tax ballot measures for 2026, as well as understanding trade-off and service level priorities with community members. And we invite you all to participate in this engagement effort that is coming forward this summer and fall, where we'll receive input from diverse stakeholders on a trade-off of service level priorities. We'll help to educate the public on the city's budget and as well as our financial constraints that we have been seeing, particularly over the past several years. There will be opportunities for city council member engagement, and we're also performing not just in 2025, but also in 2026, a statistically valid polling survey that will help to inform the potential tax ballot measures that we're bringing forward. And again, the intent and focus on this is really to have broad community conversations about our service level priorities and understanding and feedback from comprehensive engagement efforts. What are the priorities that we're looking at holistically as a city, and how does that help to inform potential tax ballot measure changes for 2026? And then finally, this last slide just points to the timeline for Fund Our Future community conversations that are really coming within this window of July through October of this year. We're currently in April and May, where we're doing preview sessions to several board and commissions across the city. We'll be having a community and council forum at a city council meeting on June 12th, and that will help to frame up the conversations to come with community members as part of Fund Our Future in July through October. And we're rounding this all out in May of next year, where we'll be bringing forward narrowed options and staff analysis, as well as a holistic overview of the community conversations that we're having later this year to City Council next May of 2026. So with that brief overview, I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have. We look forward to inviting you all to engage in some of the sessions that we have coming forward this July through October.
You raised your hand.
Sue.
Hi. So I was involved in community culture, what was called community culture safety. Now it's called resilience. A while back when it went to just like 8 nonprofits, and you had to get selected to be on it, and then it went to the ballot, and then got some money. But anyway, and then the next year they came out with this other version of it that's the one you're talking about here. And I was on a task force about and stuff, but they watered down the nonprofit money to it's like a joke. And they really just, the city took, as they said, they took 90% of it. And if you look at what the nonprofits get from this, it's not enough for nonprofits to make capital investments. I mean, of course you have to raise money. It was like a quarter of what we made. But if you give a decent amount, it helps nonprofits raise the remaining capital to stay in the city of Boulder. The amounts they're giving now, like, maybe buys you a heater. It doesn't change the landscape of nonprofits staying in Boulder. And to give the city more for this, I'm really hesitant to do that, because I feel like it's such a switch, bait and switch. Because like when they promote it, they promote, oh, we're helping nonprofits and there's pictures of, my smiling bicycle people. But meanwhile, what we're really just funding is more city stuff, more city buildings. So, that's an issue. The public realm one, I know that members of council didn't like the idea of bringing this to like the absolute highest that this tax can be. And while I certainly support bike lanes and bike paths, I agree with those at council that said this seems short-sighted to raise it to the absolute highest it can be, because then you can't go higher when you have a true emergency. So plus times are bad to be raising taxes on people. So, I don't know. That's just my thoughts. Thanks.
I have a question about maybe if you go back to the slide about the public realm tax, and I don't deeply understand these taxes, so the question is, I know we have like some really big projects that are like, redoing the civic center area, like very large scale infrastructure or projects, and how does the city like distinguish between what's like maintenance of pre-existing infrastructure, like parks or buildings, versus net new, and how like that in, getting buy-in for like a tax increase like this? And is there like designation, or they just keep it very broad just to have like the full ability to spend it on whatever is needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that we are focused on within the ballot measure strategy that we, I don't know if there's a way to pen the other.
Working on it.
One of the things that we're focused on within our 2025 ballot measure framework that we are focusing on is really taking care of what we have. And so when we look at our backlog of infrastructure that we have, we're also looking at total cost of ownership. So that includes renovation, that includes replacement, that includes looking at our existing assets that we have, park assets, transportation infrastructure, for example. So we have a long list of backlog of capital projects, renovation projects, replacement projects. A great example is one that was shared for earlier with our East Boulder Community Center renovations, where we're using our current community culture, resilience, and safety tax to help support significant renovations at that area within that project that we have within our capital infrastructure needs. So we are focused in 2025 really in looking at that list that we have currently for our unmet needs. In 2026, we are focused on this more holistic conversation and inviting the community to the table to help to understand priorities across the board. Within 2025, we're really looking and focusing on taking care of our unmet needs. And so it is a blend of both looking at infrastructure as well as renovation and replacement, and total cost of ownership of capital infrastructure across the city's portfolio.
Okay, yeah, and has a related question. My sense is that over time it gets more expensive to maintain infrastructure, renovate all these things, and rising costs really of labor and materials, all these things impact that, but the public doesn't seem to have much empathy as much for those sort of things, because like the investment was made 30 years ago, but you still have to like keep maintaining it and replacing it. Right, so I think it's a challenge. Like if we continue to build new things, then we continue to have to maintain them, and the price to maintain them increases over time. So like, what's the strategy? And maybe this is more of like, how do you engage the community on this to like continue to fund things that get more expensive over time?
Right, it's a great question. It's always a balance, and we look across all of the city's portfolio and work with departments to help inform the estimates that we're looking at, and ensuring that when it gets to the time where we're investing more in an asset than instead of just replacing it, for example. So it's a balance and planned across all of the departments that we work with that focus on capital infrastructure, including community vitality, facilities and fleet, parks and rec, transportation, utilities. But it is really a blend. So it's a good question of making sure that we're focused on maintaining that balance of capital maintenance versus capital infrastructure and looking at the time period that comes forward where we know that we need to replace the asset instead of continuing to maintain. And that is one of the key focus areas of the facilities master plan. For example, we're now looking at our city facilities across the city's portfolio, which is inclusive of parks assets and recreation centers and other items like that in the city's portfolio. In terms of the point that you're making on the community engagement, we are interested in focusing on community input as part of this process. And so, as I mentioned, with our Fund Our Future work that is coming forward, this will take place this July and through August. And we're inviting, we're going to have information and input sessions and feedback that will be available through online platforms such as Secret Folder, and receiving input from community members, and hope you all will participate in that input and feedback to help inform what 2026 potential tax ballot measures look like.
I'll start by saying I own property in Boulder Junction that already pays 15 mil levy above what a normal other neighborhood in the city pays. And I understand how moving taxes from sales tax to property tax protects the city's interest and predictable revenue, but doing so is an increase every year because the property is increasing. And we are looking at a aging population that is dependent on Social Security, fixed income, as well as people who are losing their jobs right now that work for NOAA and other organizations, as well as anybody who might be impacted by a tech layoff or any other kind of layoff. And one way that residents can mitigate some of those issues is to reduce spending on discretionary income. This would not allow them to do that because everybody needs to pay rent or their mortgage and their property taxes, whether they pay them directly or through their landlord. This might be a burden to a large percentage of the population.
Yeah, could you go back to that public realm tax? I didn't get the details. So we're raising the mill levy. Is that going to the maximum or what? I don't know is it maximizing the mills? Yeah.
Yeah, so the exploration of the creation of the public realm tax is really looking at expanding the current mills that is specific to this funding source that's within the permanent parks tax and expanding the use of that tax to apply fully to the public realm. So it would be able to support and have more flexibility to support items within the public realm, increasing it from 0.9 mils to 2.25 mils. That will take and increase our mill levy to the property tax cap as I believe Sue was sharing previously. And we had internal discussions about that and discussions with the Financial Strategy Committee about that as well, and are not concerned with moving forward with that, given the backlog of need that we have within the organization. And we always have the opportunity to bring forward a potential increase. And so we've thought about that internally and thinking about raising that. And this is why this is proposed for full council consideration and potentially moving these forward. There is the option for council members to consider this in terms of moving both of these items forward, one of them forward or none of them forward for 2025. These are the narrowed options that we were thinking about over the past 6 months based on staff analysis. See guidance from Financial Strategy Committee. Does that answer your question?
Kind of. I just was wondering if you're in 2026, you're looking at holistic and we're maxing out our mills this year, does that preclude us from more holistic opportunities in using the mill caps?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are interested in looking at other potential tax options. We have, as I mentioned previously, a high level of dedicated taxes across the organization. If we look at the analysis that we've performed, the city of Boulder has the second highest along Front Range. And so what that has demonstrated to us, and in looking at the recommendations from the Blue Ribbon Commission reports, is it limits our flexibility to be able to meet community priorities of the moment. And so one of the things that we have talked about with the Financial Strategy Committee is, as an option, we could look at potential expansion of one of our current dedicated sales and use tax. For example, we could look at our current taxing base for sales and use tax, that some other cities are also exploring expanding that potential base. There's a lot of potential interest in looking at items such as a vacancy tax, for example. And so there are other options on the table that we are looking at potentially exploring. It could also mean looking at potential exploration of approval of issuing debt. So there are a multitude of options. So really, when we're thinking about 2026, it is more comprehensive, and that there are a long list of potential options that we'll be looking at. And that's something that we'll be doing ahead of May of next year as part of the work.
Do you have Sue's hand up?
Me, quick
Oh,
comment.
sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Sue.
The fire station was 37 million. Just saying, the new fire station. So maybe we could do things, bring things in a little bit lower costs.
From your perspective or the city's perspective, this is me asking, so I'm curious, what is the spectrum of most to least progressive in terms of sales of types of tax options? I feel like there's just I'm not educated about this, so I'm imagining other people aren't, like property, income, sales, use, what's the spectrum of how progressive or, equitable different types of taxes are in the, we have to fund it somehow. So there's the world of, there's what are our options, right?
That's a great question, and it's something that we're actually going to be diving into further and looking at further as part of our staff analysis, because in general, sales and use tax is generally a more regressive tax.
Yes.
Property tax tends to be more progressive. But it is something that we're going to be looking at further as part of the work that we're doing with our staff analysis on tax burdens. We are interested in looking at Boulder, specifically recognizing that there are different districts across the city that are charging more. For example, there is a good amount of revenue that comes into the downtown area that is generated by tourism, for example. And so when we're looking at the tax burden analysis, it's really a balance between, but generally speaking, sales and use tax is a more regressive tax, property tax is more progressive. Yeah.
Question. So long-term financial plan, and I'm looking at the bullet resiliency here. What we've heard is basically plan for the next 2 years to try to get us to a tax policy that would help support these things. What can you help describe what anticipation, adaption, covering quickly looks like once we get beyond 2026?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the bulk of the presentation, really just given the amount of time, is focusing most on the multi-year ballot measure framework and then the conversations to come. So that's why most of this is focused, but it is a more comprehensive comprehensive initiative that we're focused on. As part of this, as mentioned, we're working on a 5-year comprehensive plan. So we're looking at having the goals of increasing and diversifying our revenues. And so one of the pieces that we're working on within the alternative funding mechanisms work stream that we've been working on with departments for the past several months, and CV has certainly been supportive in sending this inventory forward, as a comprehensive list of our fees, looking at our cost recovery levels across all of our fees. If there is a potential to analyze and update and increase our cost recovery levels, recognizing that we're looking at that equity piece within our fees as well. That is one opportunity. We're also interested in exploring public-private partnerships, potential grant opportunities, and also tax changes. So it is a blend of all potential types of revenues that we're looking at. And so really looking at diversification of those revenues and straying away from the over-reliance of sales tax as part of that work. There was another piece to your question and now I'm not.
Well, I basically, I repeated the section of the resiliency bullet, and so it was recover quickly. I think the main thing is what we're seeing is a shorter term thing, and I think some of the questions that you're getting are like, then what happens? Because, you know, nonprofits may not be, you know, getting the money that they once were or would need more. So how do we adapt to those things once these things, if they go in place, how do we adapt to them?
So the specific piece on the adaptability, one of the pieces is really looking at our diversification of revenues, where we will be able to have more flexibility of funding and more stability of funding, particularly in times where, you know, we saw with the recent pandemic period, a steep decline in our sales and use tax revenues that impacts the services and programs that the city is able to provide out to community members. So that is something that we're focused on within the resiliency piece. The other key piece to this is really focusing on our reserve levels that we have across all of our 41 budgeted funds. And so we have a minimum reserve amount of 16.7%. General fund, we have 20%. And so we're really focused on ensuring that that is in place, in addition to our diversification of revenues to help balance both of those for being able to adapt if and when things come forward again.
We about used the time that was necessary in the agenda for this item. So are there any other burning questions at this time? Before we move on to the next? Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. And this is not the last you're going to be hearing on this topic. So there'll be a lot of opportunities to be thinking about this work. And while it was not intentional, I think it's really helpful that you all have the context of the work that's happening at the broader citywide level, thinking about the work that and the service levels throughout the city in the context of the work that we do in support of general improvement districts, which do have that higher taxing level. And as we're looking at ways to pay for the things that we want to do, if there's not going to be the level of service or the level of resources at the citywide level, what are some tools that we can employ? Some changes or adjustments we can make to the existing districts that will help us to achieve those goals. And so, as you know, we've been working on this for some time now, and we're about ready to go to city council in a couple of weeks to present some recommendations. And so you're going to be hearing from Regan and from our friends over at Puma on where we're narrowing in on those recommendations. You are our advisors as we approach city council. And so today is the opportunity for you to provide some input. It will be included in the memo that we will be providing to city council. It's due on Thursday. So if your comments are long, then there's not gonna be a lot of sleep over the next couple of days. But we do welcome them. This is the opportunity to really help inform the message that we send to city council on this work. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Regan.
Thanks, Chris. Can you share your screen?
Awesome. Let's dive right in. We can go right to the next slide. So I'll just give a brief overview of what we'll be diving into today. I'll give some context for how we got here, why we're tackling this work, and then I'll hand it over to Puma to give a background on each of our districts. We'll talk about some priorities as it relates to each of our districts, challenges that they're each facing, and then we'll go kind of district by district and go over some of the recommendations that Puma has and sets. Next slide. So just to give a bit of context as to how we got here, why we're doing this work. As many of you know, this work really supports and builds off of council's established priority of commercial area connections and quality of life improvements. And the primary goal of this project is to provide clear guidance on financial and governance tools that support the health and sustainability of our commercial districts. And as many of you are aware, serving as commissioners of our districts have evolved since being established. And so we're really seeing opportunities to address some of the challenges that we're seeing today through seeing an opportunity to address some of the challenges that we're seeing today through new or adjusted district tools. And the key focus is on our existing GIDs, so KJID, UJID, BJAD, while also considering district tools for other areas that require attention in the near term. So thinking civic area, Alpine Balsam, where the new city campus is being constructed, and 55th and Arapahoe a bit further east, but serves as a large employment center for the city. And so through an RFP process, we selected Puma, who I will be handing it over to shortly. They've been tasked with conducting an existing conditions analysis, which is reflected in the district profiles that were included as an attachment in your meeting packet. And they really leveraged past plans and studies and some supplemental engagements to ultimately craft recommendations for us today. Maybe I'll use that. Here.
Oh.
Right in front of it, it's perfect.
By the way, you guys should have t-shirts or something. GID Fest, right? GID Fest 25. I mean.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I know we've gotten to see many of you on the screen, but it's great to see you all in person. So thank you for having us. Like Regan mentioned, a big part of our analysis to date was to understand existing conditions in each of the districts. Again, like Regan mentioned, there's more detail on each of the districts in your packet. So if you really want to dig into details, there's an opportunity to do that, but we'll give you some highlights here just to set the stage and maybe give you some context about the districts that you are not on the commission of. So here's just a summary of some characteristics of each district. KJID and UJID were both formed in 1970 with the intention of creating parking infrastructure and or managing parking. KJID currently has a mill levy about 3.7 mils, and then UJID's mill levy is 1.7. BJAD has two districts, as those of you who are on the commission know. There is the parking GID and then the transportation demand management GID, and they do have some overlapping boundaries, but also are not totally contiguous. So I'll just note that. Both were formed in 2010 and have slightly different purposes. BJAD-P is intended to manage parking. And then the TDM GID was formed for the purpose of transportation demand management, as the name suggests. So the parking GID has a 10 mil levy, and then the TDM mill levy is 5. So when we met with you all last, we mentioned that we looked at some key market indicators. So we're just going to give you a couple highlights here. Where the data was available, we looked back to 2016 through 2024, just to understand what was happening before the pandemic and then since. So you can see here, retail vacancy. It might be a little hard for you all to read from the back there. But in general, retail vacancy has been trending up in all of the GIDs since the pandemic. Keep on moving here. This next chart looks at office vacancy, again, where data is available. So you can see actually BJAD is doing quite well with office vacancy despite the pandemic. But UJID and KJID are hovering right around 20% following the pandemic. And then the last market indicator I'll highlight here is property value. So I know the graph is a little skewed because Cage's value is so high above the others. But I'll just point out the percent change on the side over there, which I think is really helpful. Note that these are not inflation adjusted numbers. So just something to keep in mind. Cage's overall property value has gone up slightly. UJIT's has gone up. Most of that change actually happened between 2023 and 2024. It's hard to tell, again, it's the bottom line there, but there has been some growth in property value. And then BJAD has experienced the most growth, as you can see on the right there. I know there's a lot going on this slide, so we can come back to it if anyone has any questions. But this is a total budget for each of the districts. And then we looked at the top 3 sources of funds and top 3 uses of funds. So you can see there are consistencies across some of the districts, but also some differences. Parking revenue, property tax generation are consistent sources of funds through several of the districts. And then some top uses of funds, administration, capital improvement plan, and let's see what else, administration, district management, things of that nature. Again, I know there's a lot happening here, so we can come back if folks want to dig into those numbers. Here are district priorities, which we shared with all of you when we met with you virtually. Again, some consistencies and some key differences here. And we came up with these priorities based on previous planning efforts and some strategic stakeholder engagement that we did as part of this process. So I'll just go through and highlight a few things for each district. Cajun, there are some key capital improvements that are needed moving forward, including Pearl Street improvements, the civic area redevelopment, which is very topical given where we are today. The future of downtown office space coming out of the pandemic is a key consideration. And then just general maintenance on operations of the infrastructure in downtown. For UJID, safety, that is consistent with CAGID, and the connectivity between those 2 districts is a really key priority looking to the future, particularly with the new investments that have happened on the Hill with the development of the hotel and convention center. Diversifying UJID beyond just an undergraduate destination is something we heard. And then we also heard that there has been high business turnover and some economic stagnation within UJID. For BJAD, there are some different priorities. Ensuring the district is walkable and transit-oriented is a key one. Looking at the second phase of redevelopment for that area is another key priority. Now that the first phase is largely complete. And then continuing to look at capital improvements and the transportation demand management components are also very important. Some challenges. I don't think there will be any surprises for you all here, but some key challenges for CAGID. There has been some mission creep for the GID beyond its original mission, which was parking. So we just wanted to flag that here. Several folks that we spoke with don't really understand the difference between what CAGID does versus what the business improvement district does. So we wanted to point that out here and just address it. Some capital maintenance liability and the funding of long-term capital improvement needs as a key challenge for CAGID as well. For UJID, there's more of an issue with the amount of funds being generated and being able to cover what the district's priorities are. We've heard that there are some really clear priorities, and yet the assessment revenue is not sufficient to cover those priorities looking to the future. So we're going to be looking at recommendations to address that. For BJAD, actually the opposite problem. So funding levels currently exceed what we have for some future planned program and infrastructure improvements. The role of the districts in the phase 2 of Boulder Junction redevelopment is unclear. And then figuring out the right mill levy amounts for this district is also very important, in addition to the fact that we have 2 districts overlapping currently. And so now I think, Brad, I'm gonna turn it over to you to talk about what all that means.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So I'm going to talk about recommendations for each district. There's one slide for each district. Apologize, I didn't realize this would be an eye test for you folks from the middle of the table to the back, but we'll walk you through these. And if you recall, our task was to look both at near-term and then longer-term adjustments to your districts. So near-term, we were really looking at a horizon of the next 6 months to 2 years. Longer term, we were looking beyond 2 years. So on KGID, immediate actions, one that we think could happen pretty quickly is just to get a better idea of what KGID does, what the bid does, and really identify, are there redundancies here? And are there tasks and or resources that should be pushed to one side of the ledger or the other? So that's an initial recommendation that really just takes time. It takes staff time, it takes collaboration with the bid to really understand what are we each paying for, what can we clarify moving forward. The second one here is a big one, and it took up 3 pages of your staff report. And this is coming from both downtown and the Hill. And I mentioned to you all when we met in prior both in person and virtual sessions. I've done a lot of work with your districts, particularly the Hill and downtown, going back 25 years. And this is the first time I remember the Hill and downtown being aligned in terms of vision and aligned around the notion of how do we connect the visitor experience between the two. And a lot of that is driven by the hotel investment. But also acknowledgement of the close proximity between downtown and the Hill. So certainly before we started on this, folks have been talking about a downtown development authority for a year, 2 years, longer, for a while. There's been talk about a downtown development authority. For better or worse, we're well versed in that. We've helped to create about a half dozen of these over the last 3 or 4 years. So we were able to evaluate this opportunity for downtown, for the Hill, perhaps beyond. And as you can tell from the staff report, also from the community dialogue that we sort of parachuted into, this is a compelling opportunity for Bolton. So why a DDA? Why does that make sense? Well, from a revenue standpoint, and really this whole session today is really focused on revenue. There are 2 revenue sources through a DDA. One is unique, one is not. The unique revenue source through the DDA is something called tax increment financing. Many of you may be aware of what that is. The only 2 entities in Colorado that can utilize tax increment financing are a DDA or an urban renewal authority. Tax increment financing does not increase anybody's taxes. That's something to put on the table initially because there's tax fatigue. There's uncertainty in the economy. It's a difficult time to be talking about additional revenue through various forms of taxation. So what tax increment financing does, it allows a geographic area, a downtown in the case of a DDA. It allows that area to capture future revenue increases from future increases in property values and sales tax. So if sales tax increases over time, the increment over and above the year we create the DDA, there's a base year. Let's say 2026, pulling a number out of the hat, is a base year for a DDA. Whatever sales tax revenue is collected by the city in that year would continue to be collected by the city. But if that increases into 2027 and beyond, that increase, that increment could come back into the district and be reinvested. Same with property tax revenue. So if property values in 2026 are at some level, and then there's reinvestment in the area, that increment, that increase in property tax revenue, not the mill levy, not the tax, but the revenue because values are increasing, that increment can be captured and reinvested into the area. So you're going to see the same recommendation for KGID and UGID. The potential for a downtown development authority that could potentially encompass both areas and Broadway and the connection in between. Potentially too, continuing on Broadway up to the Alpine Balsam area as well. It's a pretty broad area that could be encompassed by a downtown development authority. Tax increment financing is an option. Also, a mill levy is an option through a DDA. So a DDA can add up to an additional 5 mills. There are some interesting implications of that, of the mill levy. The 5 mills exceeds the mill levies currently collected by both Cajun and Eugene. So in theory, you could potentially create a DDA and actually consolidate both your GIDs and eliminate them, and have the GID assets and programs run by a DDA. So there's a lot of compelling opportunity for Boulder through the DDA. Tax increment financing, potential mill levy. We can talk more about that. Because of the timing of sort of parachuting in here, also looking at data, when we look at valuation data from both the Hill and downtown, and we look at sales tax, you guys have stagnated since the pandemic. The Hill has stagnated beyond that, really over a 10-year period. There hasn't been real growth. And when you factor in inflation, there's been erosion in sales tax and property values. So you can actually make a pretty compelling case that an economic stimulus is needed in both areas moving forward. So that's the DDA. We can go back to it again. It's a big chunk of your staff report. There may be a lot of questions. Because it's such a compelling opportunity, the way we are pitching this is let's evaluate the DDA opportunity. Again, this applies to downtown the Hill. Let's evaluate that, see if it makes sense to take a run at that. If that doesn't happen though, how do we continue to look at different revenue sources? Because we got a lot of needs. So these alternative strategies, and it'll be the same structure for the Hill. Boulder Junction, you're different. You'll be treated a little differently in terms of recommendations. So alternative strategies if the DDA doesn't happen downtown. Debrucing to increase your mill levy. So what's debrucing? The downtown, Cajun and University, mill levies. One reason they're relatively low is because as values have increased, Tabor, which is part of the Colorado Constitution, limits increases in taxes to a formula. It's a formula of growth and inflation. So your mill levies have actually come down considerably from what they were and what they could be because of this Tabor adjustment on your districts. So you could vote. It would require, all of this would require a vote, by the way. DDA would require a vote within the boundaries, not citywide, don't worry, but it would require a vote within the boundaries of the affected area. Similarly, if we're going to debruce, it would require a vote within the boundaries of Cajun, within the boundaries of the Hill. Pearl Street PIF, this would be an additional, this would be a fee added to sales tax. So a PIF is a public improvement fee. You see this at Flatirons Mall at the shopping center. So if you look at your sales receipt there, you'll see PIF, another 1% I think they charge on sales up there. Potentially could be employed within downtown. Again, would require a vote by properties that are affected by that. Sales tax, while yes, regressive on the sort of continuum of taxes, it does export a fair amount of the tax burden because visitors, you have a lot of visitors that are buying stuff. So there's a pretty healthy percentage, and particularly with some new events coming to town, there's going to be a pretty healthy percentage of sales tax revenue that you'd actually have from visitors. These discussions today, it was very timely to have the citywide finance plan talked about today. Because the notion of any citywide action for a bond issue or the parks fee or the mill levy on the parks, downtown, and for that matter, all your districts should be in the discussion. Just don't think that just because you have an improvement district, that if you've got a high dollar capital need, we should also be on the radar for citywide votes when those come up. So that's something to put in here. And then also, and really only in a spot use within downtown, but there are other tools. There is urban renewal. So again, if the DDA doesn't happen, urban renewal, which has a bad rap, has bad reputation, you do have it in Boulder. It can be used for properties that are blighted. So there are state criteria for figuring out what a blighted property is. And if you have a blighted property, you can use that tax increment financing again. It's the same tool we talked about with the DDA. So not a lot of opportunity, but there may be selected sites where that could be employed. All right. Eugene, Hill, immediate action. Let's look at that DDA. So let's see how that makes sense, the connection to downtown. In this process, I met with a group of folks from the Hill and the downtown that are looking at this. What are they called? The Connectors, right? Great Boulder name. So we met with this group called Connectors, and there's a lot of folks there, and there are a lot of folks that have been around for a while. There's some folks who've just sort of parachuted in. I asked them. I said, if you created a DDA that connected the Hill and downtown, it's likely that downtown's revenue is going to drive most of the revenue in that DDA. You just have so much more property value, as you saw in one of those graphs, so much more sales. And, in theory, you're going to be helping to generate revenue that some of that's going to be downtown, some of that could be in the Hill, but you may be indirectly subsidizing what's going on in the Hill. There was no anxiety about that at all. So there was a clear sense of purpose. We're in this together. Someone has a bad experience on the Hill, that's going to be bad for downtown, particularly if they're visiting a hotel or for an event. Alternative strategy. So we're putting a lot of eggs in the DDA basket, particularly for the Hill. That doesn't happen. We could debruce that mill levy. Our mill levy is small, but the valuation up there is small. So the magnitude of additional revenue you could raise through a mill levy increase, somewhat limited on the Hill. Parking rates. Do we have the right parking rates? Is there an opportunity to recover more revenue that way? Citywide bond issue, again, making sure that if the Hill has some significant capital need, they think of that. And these, again, urban renewal on a spot basis for any properties that are technically blighted. There's also another intriguing opportunity we feel as a gap, because there's a lot of angst right now, both downtown and the Hill, about the visitor experience with these hotels opening up and just dropping people on Broadway. And then they have to figure out where do I go? What do I do? What's going on here? So a real desire to improve the visitor experience through maybe subtle ways or not so subtle ways. There is a recently approved lodging business assessment area. This is a tax on your hotels. I believe it's room nights that there's a tax. So if I stay in your hotel, there's going to be a buck or two that's added to my room night. It's a fairly significant revenue stream, and we're suggesting, at least in the interim, until the DDA creation is played out, if there is a need to improve that visitor experience immediately, look at capturing a portion of that lodging business assessment area from the two new hotels. I mean, they're right there, and maybe some of the downtown hotels as well. So we think there's an opportunity there as well. Last but not least, needed actions. We are all on board on this notion of merging these two districts. So you got two districts. The intention was great, parking, transportation, demand management. It's created some administrative burden. You got two boards. There's some ambiguity sometimes between what are these dollars for, what are those dollars for. It's actually rather expensive. So is there an opportunity to merge these districts? The challenge there is the geography is not precise. So the transportation demand management footprint is larger than the parking footprint. So we'd have to look at how, if we're going to merge them, we got to get to a footprint that's the same for both. And then there's some legal There's always, welcome to improvement districts, you know that. There's always going to be some legal. Also immediately analyze expansion options for the next phase of Boulder Junction. For adjacent properties, that's pretty clear cut. Adjacent properties can annex in to the GID. They can petition, annex in, council, I believe, can approve adding those properties. But there may be more than just adjacent properties that we want to look at as the development occurs there. And then, yes, let's look at steps to reduce the mill levy. There's already been, those of you on the BJAD boards have already sent this request, I believe, to council. We think there's justification for that. The challenge is we want to make sure, though, that you still have opportunity if there's future needs where you need to adjust your mill levy again. So our only caution on that was if it's a reduction in mill levy, is it temporary in case you need to go back to the tool for larger expenditures down the road? And then short term again, in terms of development, and a lot of this might be phase 2 or beyond, all these adjacent properties to the east. Again, urban renewal. You can actually make the case, and I don't want to insult anybody who has an industrial property over there, but you can make the case of blight pretty easily over there in terms of just the conditions of some of the properties, particularly if there's redevelopment that's proposed. There are also other district options that have not been heavily used in Boulder that are actually well suited for new development. So at I think the BJAD meeting we were at in March, I talked about metropolitan districts, which have a shaky history on the Front Range. They've been used inappropriately by developers in a handful of communities, maybe more up and down the Front Range. But it's a very powerful tool for infrastructure finance. So if there's new development of scale, it is a powerful tool. And my response back to the BJAD folks when we talked about this is part of the problems with metro districts was negligence by local governments. Local governments didn't put up guardrails for these developments. And I would expect Boulder to approach this, if they did approach it, in a much more sophisticated way than, sorry, some of your neighbors up and down the Front Range. So is that it? I'm controlling it. So why am I looking over there? I think that's it.
Can I ask a question?
I think we got all time in the world now for questions. Yeah.
So I bet you could do this pretty easily. I'm wondering if you could give a sense of the scale, orders of magnitude difference between all the revenue options. Not that I'm asking for like revenue projections, but like $1, $2, or $3 signs. And which is a framework I use like with my customers to like try and give them a sense of orders of magnitude without getting too specific. When you would do that, the caveat question is the goal to get like a portfolio approach to revenue where there's like a lot of different sources of revenue, or just like shoot for the big one, which I assume is the DDA, but I don't know.
So great question. Love your method. We actually sent $1, $2, and $3 signs to the city for the cost for exploring these things. So very familiar with your scale, but it's different. It is different orders of magnitude. So with BJAD, right now you've got 15 mills. That's a heavy burden on a commercial property. The only higher improvement district of your type that I can think of, higher mill levy in the state, is actually Cherry Creek North. So you are the Cherry Creek North of Boulder of improvement. So you can run me out of the room right there. So I mean, the options here are limited because you've got the GIDs, you're generating sufficient revenue. So to me, that's a year-to-year adjustment type of deal. What revenue is really needed coming up. Urban renewal could be a $2 to $3 sign tool, depending upon the scale and scope. Metro district could be a $2 to $3 sign based upon, and $2 to $3 is a lot of money. $1 sign or a cent. I use a cent sign sometimes because it's paltry. The metro district I was talking about in terms of a finance tool for infrastructure $2 to $3 sign. It's fairly significant what that could raise.
I know you're answering about BJA, but you specifically were asking about downtown, correct? Or more interested, but
Oh,
I'm a team player.
you opened it up. I gotta give you the tour. And downtown's gonna be last, so nobody's gonna leave. So, okay, DDA, it's a $2 to $3 sign. Probably a $3 sign. If you activate both sides of it, it's a $3 to $4 sign, because you've got the tax increment financing, which can be considerable over time. A DDA has a 30-year life. Then you can extend it 20 years. Then you can extend it 20 years. It's a 70-year potential proposition. Now that base gets adjusted if you extend. But still, the tax increment, the combo of the tax increment and the potential mill levy is, if you're looking to raise revenue on the type of civic improvements that we're talking about, it's a $3 to $4 sign. Debrucing your mill levy, usually that's going to be a cent or a $1 sign, just because of the magnitude. But if you did that downtown, it could be considerable. Parking revenue, you're not going to get that much more. You're not going to squeeze that much more out of parking revenue on the hill. I mean, downtown, maybe. But on the hill, it's really limited. And the hill sold one of its parking assets, right? That's how they're doing streetscape now. Is you sold your assets and you're using some of that money for streetscape. Citywide bond, I mean, that's where the big money is, right? If you can get this whole city to help support improvements in your districts. So, that's a $3 to $4. Urban renewal, as we talked about earlier, $2 to $3 sign. This lodger's tax is intriguing to us. It's probably a $1 sign, but as a gap filler, while we got angst about, the visitor experience here in the near term, it may be worth it just so that most of y'all could sleep a little bit better. And then the last one here, downtown. DDA, $3 to $4 sign. Debrucing, probably a couple dollar signs here. Your mill levy is fairly low. It's 3.7. I remember that right. You have the ability to go all the way to 10, nearly 10. So, I mean, there's a fair amount of room there. You could potentially triple that. The Pearl Street PIF, on sales, if you added a penny on sales in a defined area, that's probably a $1 to $2 sign type of thing. Citywide bond issue, again, that's big. Urban renewal on a site specific could be significant. And I'll close by just saying, yes, you want to diversify your revenue sources. That's kind of what you want to do. You don't want to be reliant on any one of these, even if you form a DDA. It's going to take a while for that increment to build, because you'd have a base year and then you got several years. If we did this in 2019, you wouldn't be making a lot of money today. So, you gotta be a little patient with that increment and know that that's, $4 signs maybe 10 years from now, but it may be $1 sign in the first 5 years. Did that help? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So the formation of a DDA, you mentioned that you've not seen this alignment in a generation and a half, maybe more. That's been one of the things that I have anxiety about, and irrational anxiety. I don't know anything about this kind of thing, but in my head, I've said, well, DDA makes sense, but then downtown sucks up all the air out of the balloon. And how does the Hill maintain its ability to generate funds within the DDA? If you could help me understand the answer to that question and then go further and give us some of the pitfalls of DDA, like what are the risks in entering into a DDA?
Sure. So let me answer the Eugene question first. There's a couple ways that you can safeguard the original intent of what you want to do. The first one, so I mentioned urban renewal requires a blight study, that you have a blighted building. Not with a DDA. A DDA requires something called a plan of development. Plan of development is essentially an action plan and a business plan for the DDA. a plan of development would be created by the affected area, stakeholders in the affected area coming up with essentially bundles of different improvements that we would do. So there may be a connectivity bundle, to connect the two. There may be a small business support bundle that both downtown and health support. There may be a couple things unique to downtown, the Pearl Street improvements may be in a bundle. Additional streetscape in the Hill may be a bundle. So the plan of development is sort of safeguard number one, because that gives us the sort of full palette of what the DDA can do. The second one is governance. So the DDA is managed by a board of 5 to 11 members. That board is appointed by your city council. That board actually has more influence over what happens with the DDA revenue than you guys do, your advisory boards for council. So the DDA is a little bit more independent than that. In constructing the DDA board, there could be a very concerted effort about who sits on that thing. So, for example, if we want to make sure the Hill has a voice, we could say X number of seats on this board will be property business owners, resident from the Hill. X numbers of seats could be from downtown. We go to Alpine Balsam, maybe there's a seat for them. So, so I would say that's how a DDA stays focused. And if we're living in a momentary moment of goodwill and love, we capture that in the plan of development. And then you perpetuate it through a governance structure that has all these folks represent. Anything to add to that? Nope. Pitfalls of a DDA. Boy, there's not a lot. There's about 24 of these throughout the state of Colorado. But I'll say a few things. Like anything, they are a new enterprise. They're a business, and you got to run and manage it well. DDA, you would want, you'd want competent people on your board, like you guys, on the GIDs. You'd want staff allocated. That's another beauty of the DDA. We love our staff, but man, they're pulled all over the city. DDA would have dedicated staff just for the DDA working on that. But you got to make sure you got some, competent people doing that. So running the business well. That's one. I do think, and it's to your point, I think there's some caution here if this thing gets too big. If the thing gets too big, it can lose sort of its central purpose. It can get a little unwieldy. There is some restriction here on a DDA. There's only one per city. And it does need to have a relationship to the historic central business district of the city. That's the intention. So certainly downtown, you can make the argument, I think, pretty easily that downtown and the Hill evolved similarly, similar timetable. Beyond that, it might be a little tougher. Did that answer your question?
That was great. Thank you.
Okay. There was, did you?
Yeah.
Well, there was a hand up here too.
Yeah, I was just curious. You mentioned the length of the DDA being 30-20-20.
Yeah.
What's the length of the other alternative strategies? And how does that?
Oh, really?
Is
Good
that
question.
annually or?
So your GIDs are perpetual. They are forever. They have no time limit. Congratulations. You didn't know your term would last forever. Some of these other special districts, like a metro district, they have set terms. Metro district, I think, can go up to 40. That's the one you would use for infrastructure, and you would use it for bonds to pay for infrastructure. Urban renewal is a 25-year life. And then the 30-20-20 has some strings. So 30 years, if you want to extend your DDA after that, your base changes. You can't use, if you did this in 26, just thinking randomly. If you did this in 26, and that was your base 30 years later in 2056, you can't do another 20 years at 26. You got to bring your base up to 10 years prior to what you're doing it. So there's some limitations in there. There's some adjustments in there. Probably the best example for you guys for a DDA, and I don't want to get into trouble because, I'm cognizant of rivalries, but Fort Collins, that downtown has been pretty much supported, built, infused with capital from its DDA. And it's gone through the 30, now it's in a 20. Does that help? Okay. Other, yeah,
Sorry, were you gonna answer something else along that line before I ask you?
was there another thing I should answer?
No, not on that particular one.
Okay.
I haven't seen the use of a TIF against sales tax revenue before.
Yeah.
We did just hear from the city that there are shortfalls in other areas of the city, it's particularly for Boulderites that live here and work here. My concern for that would be, would we be hamstringing the city if we gave up future revenues from one of the main tourist
Yeah.
spending areas in town?
Really, really good question. So, you know, the good news is we're not raising your taxes. The flip side of that is we're bringing money from somewhere. So where is it coming from? So in sales tax, yeah, that's the city portion of sales tax that would be generated from our DDA boundary would be essentially frozen at that 2026 level. Any increment above that would be reinvested, and there's more. Property tax. Where's the bulk of your property tax go? Schools, Boulder Valley schools. So on the property tax, if you're going to freeze that level at 2026, property tax is a little different, and I'll explain this in a minute. But you've got other taxing authorities that potentially could be sacrificing future revenue for the good of downtown and the Hill and Boulder. The property tax thing is a little bit more nuanced, because with the sales, 2026, bam, that's our cap. Everything above that, we're reinvesting. Property tax is nuanced because that base, you'll get appreciation in the base. So if your base is $100 and there's inflation or there's other adjustments in that base will go up a little bit. But the value from new investment, that's the increment that we're talking about. So if you do pursue the DDA, one of the steps, one, the city's going to do an internal analysis because they've got both sales and property tax potentially that's coming in here. And you got to go talk to Boulder Valley Schools. And you got to go talk to the county because you're potentially using, you know, their future tax revenue to invest in your downtown. And you need to make a compelling argument. Why should we invest in downtown Boulder? I will say this, we just did this in Lafayette. I realize Lafayette is small. But we dealt with the same characters. And from the schools, what they said is, look, we're in a really tough time. Our budget is tight. But if you improve downtown Lafayette and it's more family friendly and more people with kids are going to move here, that's more important to us. The county was a little bit more judicious because, again, Lafayette was such a small little slice of the pie. They said, well, that's kind of a rounding error, so that's fine. You can have our money. But you have to make the case for the different taxing authorities. So did I answer your question in all of that?
Yeah, I think so, but I think it's something that if I were on those boards, I would be extremely cautious about.
Yep.
It's just the geographic area that increase just the taxes from that geographic area.
Correct.
Could you also argue that for the schools and other county-based taxing that like perhaps the majority of the families are also in the non-UGID
Yes.
CAGID areas too?
That's often a case too, is that, you know, now think about that though. It depends because we may be wanting to create housing in those areas and that could create, you know, are we gonna have families living downtown? You know, probably a small percentage, but we could. So you're not necessarily creating more demand for their services by doing this. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is a caution for Boulder, and for them, is that you're in stagnation mode right now. I mean, both downtown, because when I first started working on this, I don't know, when did we start working on this? First of the year? It's been fast and furious. But I was like, DDA and Boulder, I mean, you guys are awash in revenue. I mean, you're the heart of privilege along the front range. Sorry. But that, you know, that's the perception coming in here. Well, when you look at the numbers, you're not. And when you look at the numbers, you're in economic stagnation on the Hill for a long time. And downtown since the pandemic. So I think the case to be made, one of the cases to be made to the taxing authorities, if we don't reinvest in these areas, they may slip. With the office vacancies that you have downtown, with the struggles, you know, that the Hill just perpetually has. If we don't change it up, you know, there's a big risk. Two hands over here. Chairman will pick.
Okay, I'm just curious if you could expand maybe a little bit more on what you might see with the phase two expansion in Boulder Junction. How that relates to the current board structure. GID.
Well, let's take it a step at a time, because I think we want to look at consolidation first. No, so let's look at consolidation first. It's a lot. I don't want to say easier, but it makes a lot more sense to us that you have one district that does these things. You can budget, because one of the questions we had at one of your meetings was, if we consolidated, because how do we preserve the mill for parking? How do we preserve it for TDM? The easy answer to that, we did talk to legal counsel, is you do it through budget. So you budget a certain amount of mills for each. But if you had one district, one board, this notion of expanding into Boulder Junction 2 just becomes more clear cut. So do you offer more representation, you know, on the board, on the governance board, some sort of proportional representation? If you have two districts, it's a little trickier. And if we have two districts, we're sort of multiplying the complexity here, because we got two boards, two options for expansion. Also, the other thing I think you wouldn't want to do, although the city will have influence of this, but you don't want to get into haggling by the properties coming in of, well, we want to be in parking, but we don't want to be in TDM. I mean, that could be kind of problematic. So there's just, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but as it expands, the board structure could adapt. But I do think, we think that going from 2 to 1 could have some advantages in many, many ways. Yeah.
So just because this is building off yours, not to avoid you yet. So I mean, I do support merging them and bringing TVAP phase 2 into the same district, but a couple of things. First of all, we do have properties that are joining one, not the other. That's why we have different property lines. A big problem with them joining is the mill levy on the parking district, right? That is significant. Some history that you may not be aware of is that we have tried to waive pilot fees for nonprofit properties or affordable housing, and we have been unable to do that legally up until this point. So that has been a potential barrier with phase 2 joining in, is that they will be responsible for pilot fees to catch up to all of us that have been paying it until now.
Good to know. Thank you.
It just, to build on that, I worked on the REV and we couldn't join BJAD, so I'm not really sure. We joined the TDM, but not the Access District, and it wasn't an option. So, and Google did the same, so I'm not really sure how.
We would love you to join.
Well, it's too late.
It's never too late. We'll take your money.
Back then, I mean, I was told you just can't because there's no parking district for your side of Pearl, so there's no.
So,
I mean, this is a long time ago, it was Molly Winter,
Yeah,
but it
yeah.
was,
Chris, I'm looking at
it
you.
didn't seem like an option, this is a long time ago, but I'm just like, the idea that these boundaries have been weird for a long time.
So I'm looking at Chris, because my understanding is part of this work could then be a springboard into getting this resolved. So if along with you, we're saying, hey, this is kind of funky and there could be a better way to do it, then that creates the platform to go to the city council and say, hey, we need to go the next step. Is that correct? You're not?
Yes, and it's just making sure that we're thinking about the nuances from the forming ordinances that stipulate the catch up and the pilot fees. And I want to follow up with you after the meeting on.
It was a while ago,
So-
but it was interesting what
Yeah.
happened.
And we can talk offline later.
Someone's been very patient over here.
Andrew.
So as we think about this potential discussion of the DDA between, for example, the school district and the county.
Yeah.
as I think about it, there's the issue of, it's a very small area the DDA would be, but the idea being that, that they would lose that incremental revenue, but then the flip side is the increase of property value for the county and whatnot, and so more revenues being generated on that end. You know, as a sort of an expert in the field, is there a way to conduct an analysis of how much of you know, the DDA moving things up floats the boat even more so of the entire county, such that you know, wow, this is actually a really good deal for the school district and the county?
I'll say yes with some qualifiers on it. So that's part of what we do. So when we're working on the DDA, we'll look at projections, we'll look in the future. We'll look at what are some expectations, because another important message for the schools, county, and the city on property tax is they're not going to lose out everything. They're still going to have a natural appreciation of underlying property value. When we did this in Lafayette over 25 years, it was about 40%. So of the TIF, about 60% went into the district, about 40% of the increase continued to go to the tax. So that's sort of number one. Just say, hey guys, you're not going to lose everything. This is not zero sum. Yes, I think we need to make that, or I think you would need to make that argument of the benefit of a growing vital downtown and you know, the impacts of that. Where it gets a little tricky, and you know, as a expert, quote unquote, in this, you get into multipliers and stuff like that, and I think that's smoke and mirrors. So, you know, some economists will say, well, you know, if we grow downtown such and such amount, it's going to have a 1.5% multiplying effect on this. I think that's smoke and mirrors. So I think the way to do this is to just show them the facts. Show them here's our projections. These are sort of best case, worst case of what we think could happen over 30 years. Here's the revenue that would continue to go to you. And by the way, that revenue might not go to you if downtown continues to stagnate. And if we have a healthy, thriving, wonderful downtown and hill, we're going to have a more prosperous community. So I think there's some ways to make that, but I caution that quantifying that can be a slippery slope. Yes.
On downtown and the hill, you mentioned that would need voters within those districts to vote on it.
Correct.
Would that be only property owners or also the business owners that rent from a couple of, you know, a handful of large commercial landlords?
Yeah, so good question. Also time, I just want to make sure we're fine on time.
And I'm specifically asking this because of things like the PIF, right?
Yeah.
That may increase the
So
cost of goods for people buying and may cause issues for business owners.
almost everything we've got up here would require a Tabor election. So a Tabor election is in the affected area. You need to get the consent of electors within the affected area. Electors include property owners, including commercial property owners. They can designate someone to vote on their behalf. Tenants who are paying a lease, commercial lease, they can designate someone to vote on their behalf. And residents. So residents who are living in the affected area and are registered to vote, you know, they get to vote too. And then when you get in Tabor, there's all kinds of nuance, but that's basically commercial property owners, commercial lessees, residents. Right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Can you speak a little bit more to the, you said that DDA would not need to designate blighted areas.
Correct.
And if we didn't do a DDA, I feel like it'd be tough to qualify certain areas as blighted.
Correct.
It'd come down more to like floors or portions of areas, you know.
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to tamp down expectations on what urban renewal could do here, because you really need to meet these conditions of blight, and you're not blighted.
Right.
I mean, nor do you want to be, but There are specific parcels, specific buildings. Yeah, maybe we could make a case, but there's not a lot of blight in these areas.
And a DDA we'd be able to, I guess,
Don't-
reinvigorate things.
Yeah, I think,
Getting it to that point, I guess is what.
yeah, you're trying to prevent it, right?
Right.
Prevent it from getting blight. The beauty of a DDA, one of the reasons we get excited about it, is you can tailor your plan of development to whatever your downtown or whatever the hill needs. I mean, and you have to have some vision because you're looking ahead 30 years. But that plan of development, it's also very high level. It's not prescriptive. It doesn't say we're gonna do this on this side or this on that side. But it says, for example, I had some examples earlier, you know, we're gonna look at the Broadway connection and we're gonna improve that. We're gonna improve the visitor experience. We're gonna help one of the coolest things I've seen from a DDA actually comes from Colorado Springs. You wouldn't expect that necessarily. They have a loan program for small businesses to acquire their buildings. So, you know, small business tenants, and I know this has been an issue in Boulder in the past, local independents, rents go up, you guys get pushed out. Well, the DDA in Colorado Springs actually makes no interest loans available for businesses to buy their building. So you can be very creative. And if you look at the plan of development for Fort Collins versus Colorado Springs versus Lafayette, they're all different. They're all tailored to what's in those downtowns. It's a great tool.
Yeah,
I don't know if I should.
I mean,
but it's
it's definitely all those other cities you've seen it since becoming aware of a lot of these things. I just feel like Fort Collins more interesting as of late, Lafayette more interesting, and Boulder's getting less interesting, you know, like in a lot of ways. And
yeah, we're actually finding more and more of our work with DDAs is also to preserve the qualities of what people like about their downtown. And it's not just the buildings, you know, it's the business mix, it's the local dependence, it's finding ways to support sort of the unique DNA of it. Go ahead, but I also want to do a time check with these folks.
I think we have at least another 5 minutes here. So-
Okay, great.
I was just gonna say, I think tamping down the urban renewal is a good idea, cause Diagonal Plaza was the site that we should have done urban renewal on, and ULI did a tap on it and nothing happened. And I just don't think that's a tool Boulder uses. And then I think of like the opportunity zone and how that whole thing and how, we put a moratorium on the OZ because we didn't want outside investment. And so like, I think building up this idea that we have more control over our future through this DDA is really, like, if you look back in our history and what we've tried to do to stop outside investment, and it's happening despite that, like, I think this gives us more control over our future and destiny. And that's something that's very in our DNA in Boulder, based on some of the crazy actions that we've done. I mean, we had money, we had an opportunity zone and we chose to put a moratorium on all development, and it was like a sixth of our city. So I think we've got to be conscious of what our actual tools are versus what our appetite is for stuff like urban renewal.
Yeah, I also agree with you on the messaging potentially for a DDA. I mean, it's all about local initiative. Well,
Why haven't we considered a DDA previously?
why haven't you considered a DDA previously? Does anybody know the answer to that?
They do that.
I don't know.
I'd say, well, historically, the concept of TIF up until probably the last, probably up until the pandemic was less palatable for a lot of members of the community and previous councils, not the current council, but TIF has been used very sparingly through the existing urban renewal authority. And so that it's just that the times have changed. So.
I would guess too, that it's stigmatized as urban, TIF.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, wait a minute, there's this other tool, we could use it, and it's completely different. In terms of what it can.
Said that Fort Collins started their DDA in 2000 or about 20 years ago. Is that
About 40 years ago. long time ago.
Yeah, I just wonder how important it is to have large foundations at the table for a thoughtful development of downtowns, because I know that they are in a unique situation where they have a very strong foundation that bought up an entire city block to create a music experience there, which drives a certain culture. And so I'm just wondering how much did that influence the impact of a DDA or amplify the impact of.
In Fort Collins?
In
In Fort Collins. Yeah, I'm aware of that development. I know they worked with the DDA. And I believe they got some financial help from the DDA.
Post DDA though, it wasn't pre-DDA, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Just on that calculation, I was wondering, because Bohemian started in 2001, so.
Yeah, that was long after the DDA was there. So that's another beautiful thing is if there's a niche that you want to foster, you know, on the hill or downtown and beyond, you know, whether it's live music or apparently y'all are gonna be in the film business. You know, if there's different niches that you want to foster, you can tailor your DDA to do that.
I have a question about the electors.
Yes.
Because one of you brought up the fact that there are, you know, a few property owners who own large swaths of property. When they get one vote, do they get one vote per property they own or one property as the company entity that owns?
It's one vote per entity. So if you're a human and you own 5 properties, you have 1 vote. If you are a human that has 5 LLCs for 5 different properties, you have 5 votes. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Colorado law is very strange, particularly when you get to the table. Because that's the other thing, we're marrying a DDA law, which is pretty straightforward, with Tabor, which makes no sense whatsoever. So. You also need your city council on board with this. Be aware of that too. So yeah, so to form the DDA, legally, your city council needs to pass a resolution to actually put it on the ballot. So you need your city council on board on this. And typically when we've gone through this process successfully, we've also helped generate a draft plan of development on the front end, so you know what y'all are voting. Interestingly, the plan of development is not approved until after the vote because you need a DDA to adopt it. Yeah.
What tactic would you expect the opposition to the DDA to take in terms of trying to shift the vote away from the DDA?
You know, I don't know a lot about you guys up here, but I think in most cases, I'll just throw a guess out there that Boulder leads pretty far on the progressive side of things. You might find opposition on this use of schools and in particular, you know, school revenue to invest in a downtown while school district's going to be going through hard times. Remember the period we're going into, we almost have a recession guaranteed right now. Schools are going to lose money, federal money. So there may be more tension around that, and there may be an option to revenue share. That's the other thing, you can negotiate with taxing authorities. So put together different projections and, you know, you have different, if you exceed, you know, your expected case, maybe there's a revenue share with the school district or who else. But that would be one thing that what I've seen is in a vulnerability in other DDA formation efforts is concern about the schools. And then this is all, I mean, you guys are experts, you're on the GID board, you have some sense of what this is about. I mean, you got to translate tax increment financing and these other concepts to your constituents when you put this together. It can be fairly complicated. The last thing I'll say on a Tabor election, this Tabor doesn't help the vote because the Tabor prescribes the language that goes on the ballot. So the Tabor language is mind-numbing and it can be scary. You know, do we form a DDA? Well, that's easy. Can we raise tax increment financing over a period of time that could exceed, you know, $300 million or some crazy number? You know, are we going to bond on this? So the language of the ballot is not helpful. So there's a fair amount of education involved in this process.
I'm going to cut off questions right there. hand it to Chris for a
Thank you,
comment
Ted.
or two.
So just a reminder, we're getting ready to update our memo that is due to city council in 2 days. I think there's been a lot of healthy discussion. It's really great to hear some of the questions are the same things that we've been talking about internally. And so we'll summarize what we've heard as far as questions. But wondering if we can maybe get just a nod of commissioners as a whole, as general comfortability of the direction of this work or not, with the chair maybe leading that nod of approval of work thus far or disapproval.
This is a nod of approval, yes.
Ask one question.
Yeah.
Is there a way to get it on the 2026 ballot? And is there a way is that possible?
I think that we are anticipating.
That's what's happening?
Yeah.
Not possible to get on this ballot?
2025.
So the plan is
A
2026?
DDA, is that what you're talking?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you asking for individual nods or do you want to do
A round the horn nod? It would be welcomed.
It's like the wave, folks.
Okay.
To vote for the DDA?
Or
Right, no.
or the direction of the work so far, as far as the recommendations of immediate recommendations and alternative. I'm seeing general nods around the room.
Nods.
Important work so far. We will make sure that's reflected in the memo.
That's the first time we've ever gotten a wave. Fest t-shirts.
Well, then, thank you everyone for the discussion. We have one more agenda item before we close for the evening. Back to Ted.
Is it to me, really? Oh,
It is,
gosh.
you just have to, well.
Okay. Well, are we gonna do the summit meeting?
Actually, it's, I take it back.
Right.
Ellie's going to lead this part of the discussion.
Oh, gosh.
You're doing great.
So it's been brought up from Chair Don Poe at DMC, who's not with us this evening, but he would like to have a summit with everyone. As it was mentioned earlier, we haven't had a summit in a very long time. So I guess, I don't know, Chris.
So it got added to the agenda. If there was a desire of the commissions for such a thing, we'd want to understand maybe what the hope was to get out of that type of gathering. We don't necessarily need to make any decisions today, but just wanted to maybe put a bug in your ear. We might add it to the next meeting. So be thinking about what you all might want to get out of another opportunity to come together in this type of format and maybe do some strategic planning. Just wanted to be respectful of Don's request and make sure that you all were aware of it while we're together here today. And then we can maybe bring it up at the May meetings. We'll have new commissioners, other folks that we want to bring up to speed and new relationships to build. So that might be the right reason to do it.
Yeah, just quick question. So it sounds like we're the next meetings, like at UKMC, for example, we'll talk about this further. It'd be useful to have, if Don had a specific idea for the summit, to have that in the memo too, so we understand because maybe a great idea, just need to know more, yeah.
I would
Is it like a
assume,
retreat?
yeah, I mean, it's basically like this, actually, only with this, we have kind of the recommendations from Puma taking up the majority of the agenda. We would end up having an agenda that the commissions would all agree to, and we would discuss various matters. I would imagine the DDA would probably be on the table. That may be, I would assume maybe where he's coming from there is anticipating some movement that maybe we would want to coordinate on. But yeah, I think that that's a great suggestion.
All right, so we'll make sure that we touch on this in the May meetings.
All right. Is there anything else from staff or from members of the commission that they want to bring up at this time? Great, seeing none, we are adjourned.
Thank you.